Welcome to this latest episode of Canonically Speaking. My guest today is Sister Eleanor Campion, who hails from the town of Lismore in County Waterford, Ireland, who in 1984 joined the Cistercian Monastery for Women at St Mary's Abbey, Glencairn, which is the only female monastery of the Order of Cistercians of the Strict Observance, Trappists, in Ireland. Sister Eleanor completed her novitiate and made her first profession of monastic vows in May 1987 and was solemnly professed in October 1990. She's currently serving at the Generalate of the Order in Rome. She's recently had an article published in the Canon Law Society newsletter on changes to the law on institutes of consecrated life since the coming into force of the Code of Canon Law 1983. So I thought it might be interesting to ask about some of the more general notions of consecrated life in the Church before homing in on some of the specific issues addressed by recent legislation. So, Sister Eleanor, welcome. And perhaps first of all, you could talk a little bit about your own personal journey and how you came to join the order and your present role within it.
Thank you, Father Paul, and thank you for inviting me to take part in this podcast. After I left school, I worked for a number of years in the area of commercial banking. During that time, I was involved in a prayer group, a youth group, and there was an emphasis in the group on helping young men and women to discern their vocation. Particularly, a number of people in the group went abroad as lay missionaries. So I thought perhaps that might be the path for me. But in discerning that, a new option opened up, and that was the possibility of a call to contemplative or monastic life, a call which I resisted strongly at the beginning because it seemed so much like a waste of my time and my talents and my energy. I didn't understand why the Church values contemplative life so much. But bit by bit, the questions which began to take on an importance for me, independently of the question of my own life, the questions became answered, and then my own pathway also became clear. So it was in that context that I joined the monastery. Over the years, I've held many roles in the community. I've worked at everything from milking the cows to cooking the supper to keeping the accounts. The role that I probably enjoyed most was that of vocations director. I was the initial contact person for those who wrote with an inquiry about monastic life and helping them to find their own path, whether in the monastery or elsewhere, was, for me, a very privileged experience. In 2002, I was invited to serve at a general chapter of the order as a secretary for the English language, and I served at a number of general chapters in that capacity. It was there that I began to see the importance and the necessity of studying canon law. First of all, the importance of our own constitutions and how carefully crafted they have been, how they come out of long experience, but constantly need to be updated. I saw at the general chapter how a superior, an abbot or an abbess, once elected, becomes automatically a member of the general chapter with responsibility for updating and adapting our legislation. Many of those superiors have no training whatever in canon law, and this seemed to me to be very dangerous and very wrong. I also saw at the chapters how if somebody does not follow the law, does not follow the constitutions, which more often happens through ignorance than through deliberate defiance, they create a mess, and it's very often their poor successor who has to deal with sorting out the mess. So again, I thought there's a big need for education here, but how do we do it? So in 2015, after I had finished a term here at the Generalate as the economa, the housekeeper, I asked if I could study canon law. I came to it as a kind of second career. So that was granted, and I spent 2 years at St. Paul University, Ottawa. I got my JCL in 2017. One of my fellow students there was your recent guest, Father Justin Glynn. And in 2017, I was appointed to the Law Commission of the Order. Then in 2022, I was elected to my present role as one of the members of the Abbot General's Council.
And here you are now. I wonder if you could give a little bit of an explanation about really what consecrated life in the Church is in general, what an institute of consecrated life is, the different kinds there are of that. And also one particular point, which maybe you could clarify now, is I always understood that monasteries were for monks and convents were for nuns, but your monastery in Ireland bears that name. Is there a fundamental difference or a distinction?
Generally, the word monastery is associated with monks and convents with nuns, but those are not juridical terms. The conventual friars minor, for example, the conventual Franciscans, are men friars, but they live in a convent, which simply means the place where people come together. In our order, we tend to use monastery and monastic for both monks and nuns. Since the earliest times in the Church, some people have felt a call to follow Christ more closely than they otherwise could by going often literally into the desert. The first form of consecrated life was often lived by hermits in the desert, or at least in isolation from surrounding society. As this progressed, it became evident that it was easier to live this kind of life together. And so community life developed in the West, in the East first through St. Pachomius and St. Basil, who established rules for monasteries. In the West, through various monastic legislators, the great one being St. Benedict. Their rules initially were for individual monasteries. But as time passed by, religious life itself took on many different forms. The fundamental element of monastic life, of religious life, is that it's a life of consecration to God, expressed through what the Code of Canon Law describes as the evangelical counsels of poverty, chastity, and obedience. However, those of us who follow the Benedictine tradition don't actually profess poverty, chastity, and obedience. Our vows are obedience, stability, which binds us to a community, and conversatio morum, which can be interpreted, translated in one of two ways, either as conversion of life or as fidelity to monastic life. Both of them express the ongoing commitment to the monastic project, and it includes the concepts of poverty and chastity.
And your own order, the Cistercian order, derives from the Benedictine order. It was a reform, I believe, of the Benedictine order, but you belong to the order of the strict observance. Is that a further reform within the reform?
It was a kind of split, yes. In Britain and Ireland, we refer to ourselves as Cistercians, but here in Italy and in many other places, I have to refer to myself as a Trappist or a Trappistine. After the French Revolution, for various historical as well as ideological reasons, there was a split in the Cistercians. Our order is the Order of Cistercians of the Strict Observance. The other order is the Sacred Order of Cistercians. Since they don't exist in Ireland or Britain, there's no danger of or being confused with them there. But here, Cistercians are the OCSO and we are the Trappists. Historically, we developed slightly differently. For example, their monks not infrequently take on the care of parishes, which ours do not, or they have an apostolate in education, which we generally do not have. Today, I think the differences are far less between us, and it's okay, we're talking to each other again.
Which is an interesting point, because many people, if they hear of Trappists, think that Trappists don't speak at all, or they take some sort of vow of silence. What's the situation there?
There never was a vow of silence. There certainly was a very strict interpretation of silence, to the point that a whole sign language developed, which is quite akin to the sign language that's used regularly for and by deaf people. But there never was a vow of silence. Today the emphasis is, yes, on times and places of silence, but also on the responsible use of speech, which is perhaps much more difficult than silence. Not to gossip, not to speak critically, not to be negative. Sometimes it's easier just to say nothing, but that's what we're called to.
So the day-to-day life in the order involves a combination of community and solitude, having to find a balance between the two.
Yes, that's right. And while some people may be more drawn to one than to the other, it's really important that somebody is able to live healthily both of those aspects, the community dimension and the finding God in solitude. That's part of the discernment process, especially in initial vocation. Can somebody live the healthy relationships that community requires and also spend time every day alone with God?
And a lot of that time is spent working, presumably, doing manual work.
There are 3 elements in the day. We spend a lot of time singing the Divine Office in choir, beginning usually around 4 in the morning during the hours of darkness, in order to have prayer at night. That's the idea of getting up so early. Then all the other hours of the liturgy during the day. There's time for personal prayer and Lectio Divina, and time for work, according to whatever industry or income-generating labour a monastery has, and of course also the various other works in the monastery, the administration, the cleaning, the cooking, looking after guests, which is also an important part of our monastic life.
In the Canon Law Society newsletter, you wrote about some of the recent changes to the law on institutes of consecrated life. And in particular, one of these documents is the 2018 instruction Cor Orans, Praying Heart, which, well, perhaps you could explain what the main purpose is of the document, what it's intending to achieve, and some of the challenges perhaps that it poses, at least for some institutes.
Yes. 2016, Pope Francis issued an apostolic constitution, Vultum Dei Quaerere, on the topic of women's contemplative life. The aim of this document was to be an aid to renewing women's contemplative life in the Church, because a number of problems were arising and it was necessary to address these. A press conference at the time was given by members of the Dicastery for Religious Life, in which some interesting statistics were given. There are about 4,000 monasteries of contemplative nuns in the world, more than half of those in Europe, with particularly high numbers in Spain and Italy. While many of them belong to orders such as the Carmelites, the Dominicans, Poor Clares, etc., many do not. Almost half of those contemplative nuns have no connection or link at the juridical level with any other monastery of nuns. They are dependent either on the local bishop or directly on the Holy See. As a result, they can experience a great lack of the possibility of sharing resources with others who live the same charism. And being dependent on a bishop or a bishop's delegate who has no personal lived experience of monastic life, opportunities for true renewal are often diminished. Now, as Europe experiences what we call the vocations crisis, many problems arise with fragile communities and lack of people available to take on leadership or formation responsibility in monasteries and so forth. So, in order to strengthen the life of these communities, Vultum Dei Quaerere was issued by Pope Francis, and Cor Orans is the instrument which applies and brings in the concrete directions, putting Vultum Dei Quaerere into practice. Vultum Dei Quaerere has the highest authority of all church documents. It's an apostolic constitution. In particular, it called on all monasteries to belong to a federation, to avoid the many monasteries who have no other juridical links with anybody. It called on all monasteries to be federated with a federation president and a federal council, a federal formation program, and various possibilities of exchanging resources. It also addressed questions around cloister, around formation, and around autonomy. The aims of Vultum Dei Quaerere were very good. The aims of Cor Orans were good. Unfortunately, there's a great principle in the code itself which establishes general principles in the code and asks religious institutes to put the concrete details into their own constitutions, their own proper law. Cor Orans broke with this principle. Instead of giving the general principles and allowing institutes to put the details into their own proper law, it provided all the details itself, even down to things like the lengths of the term which federal council members should serve in this new structure of federation. It was a one-size-fits-all document, but one size doesn't fit all, because particularly for those institutes which already belonged to well-functioning structures, these were intrusions and seen as failure to respect the legitimate autonomy of each institute. So there was quite a negative reaction initially from many nuns, not so much against the principles of Cor Orans, but against the way in which it was delivered and imposed, leaving very little freedom to the institutes themselves. For example, in my own order, we are, I think, unique in the church in that we are monks and nuns in one order and have been since the 1890s. This is not something that happened since Vatican II. Certainly the role of women in the structures of the order and the responsibility which the abbesses have exercised has evolved greatly during that time. Prior to the Second Vatican Council, only the abbots had a general chapter and they legislated for both monks and nuns. After Vatican II, the abbesses also began to meet in general chapters. The first one was in 1971. From 1971 until 1987, chapters were held separately. One year there would be a general chapter of abbots, and the next year a general chapter of abbesses. These were held every 3 years. When it came to revising our constitutions, as every religious institute was asked to do after Vatican II, we wanted to have our constitutions for monks and for nuns as close as possible. So it made sense for the general chapters which were working on the development of the texts to work closely together. For that reason, from 1987, the 2 general chapters took place at the same time, in the same place, but voting separately. It was like that when I first attended a chapter as a secretary. So in fact, we had to keep 3 sets of minutes. The minutes of the general chapter of abbots, the minutes of the general chapter of abbesses, and the minutes of the mixed general meeting. It sounds bizarre, but it worked. It really worked very well. And in fact, 2 abbots general were elected by the general chapter of abbots and the general chapter of abbesses, voting separately, but at the same time. Eventually, the Holy See granted us the possibility of a single general chapter. That was granted in 2011, and that required some adjustments in our constitutions. Those adjustments were approved in 2014. But a few short years later, along comes Cor Orens, which was applied to us. So we had to apply for a dispensation from the requirement of federation, even though we already had a very elaborate structure providing all those things which federation was intended to provide. We had to ask to be dispensed from this new law. It was quite absurd that our existing structures simply were not recognised automatically. That was one particular aspect of Cor Orens which was difficult for us. It also has brought in differences between monks and nuns where there never were differences. The biggest one at the moment is that a man monk can make solemn profession after 3 years of temporary profession, but a nun of the order has to do 5 years of temporary profession minimum.
This is because the document only applies to women, not to men.
Exactly. It applies only to nuns in the strict sense, moniales. And I suspect it doesn't apply to the monks because there are far fewer institutes or individual monasteries of monks. So they're really not on the radar of the Holy See, or they don't cause as many problems as the nuns do. But I think what everybody resented or felt angry about was the imposition of all the details without allowing for the legitimate autonomy of each one's charism. I have heard recently some indications from the Holy See are that they are recognising that perhaps Cor Orens itself needs to be revisited, that one size does not fit all. But how long it will take for that to be put into practice, I'm not sure.
So we shall wait and see. Well, our time is running out, but thank you, Sister Eleanor, for these valuable insights into some of the details of consecrated life in general and the workings of your own order in particular. I wish you well in your work in the Generalate of the Order in Rome and in your efforts to ensure that these various legislative changes will prove to be a help and not a burden. So once again, thank you, Sister Eleanor, and God bless.
Thank you, Father Paul. It was a pleasure.
Thank you again to my guest today, Sister Eleanor Campion, OCSO. And thank you to Imma Setiadi for her rendition of C.P. Bach's Solfeggetto, which opens and closes this podcast. I'm Fr Paul Hayward, and you've been listening to Canonically Speaking. Please be sure to subscribe and follow wherever you get your podcasts for more interesting conversations from the world of canon law. Until the next time, thank you and God bless.